She didn't ask. She commanded. "You need to move, now." Her eyes scanned him like a threat, her voice sharp enough to slice through the cabin air. A black man in a first-class seat, dressed in quiet power, had just become her target. Not because he was loud, not because he broke any rule, but because his skin didn't match the privilege she believed belonged in that section. She stood over him with the weight of assumed authority, declaring, without hesitation, that he didn't belong. That was the moment it happened. The humiliation, public and precise, designed not to correct a mistake, but to put him back in place. And everyone saw it. Some nodded. Some stayed silent. Not one spoke up. He didn't resist. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at her, calm, cold, quiet. And in that stillness was something far more dangerous than defiance. He knew exactly who he was. And soon they would too. This isn't just a story about racism at 35,000 feet. It's a story about what happens when the man they try to humiliate is holding all the cards. Stick around. Like this video, subscribe for more, and let us know in the comments. What would you have done in that moment? And where in the world are you watching from? The ending will leave you breathless. Michael Carter didn't look like someone people expected to see in first class, and that became clear the moment he approached the gate. The terminal buzzed with its usual chaos. Business travelers juggling laptops, vacationers corralling children, attendants calling names with that blend of efficiency and impatience. But when Michael, in a tailored navy suit and clean-cut demeanor, stepped into the priority lane, pulling behind him a carry-on that had seen more boardrooms than beaches, Veronica Hughes, mid-40s, tightly wound blonde hair, and a face trained in polite suspicion, lifted her head from the screen and immediately hesitated. "Economy check-in is down that way," she said flatly, before even scanning his boarding pass. Her voice was soft but firm, the kind used when denying entry to someone who clearly didn't fit. Michael remained composed, his tone even. "I'm flying first class." Without blinking, he held out his boarding pass. Veronica took it reluctantly, her eyes flicking to the screen before her lips pressed together into a smile that never touched her eyes. She scanned the barcode, confirmed the seat, 1A, and handed it back, her fingers lingering as if double-checking might rewrite the truth. "One moment," she said, stepping aside to whisper something to her colleague. Michael stood silently, watching the interaction, noting the glance toward him, the raised eyebrows, the thinly veiled skepticism. He'd seen this before at hotel check-ins, executive lounges, even investor meetings, those quiet calculations behind narrowed eyes. Does he belong here? Did he win some contest? A diversity scholarship, maybe? It was never said, just written in the air like smog. Veronica returned. "You may proceed," she said, her voice clipped. "Boarding is just through there." Michael nodded once and moved on, not saying thank you, not giving her the satisfaction of discomfort. As he boarded, he passed through the sleek entryway into the cabin, the scent of leather and citrus cleaner mingling with the faint hum of jazz over the speakers. The flight attendants smiled brightly at the couple ahead of him, an older white man and his wife, greeting them with Mr. Richardson and "welcome back." But when Michael reached the front, the smile from the blonde flight attendant wavered. She glanced at his ticket again, then at his face, and hesitated just half a second too long before saying, "Right this way, sir." Michael found his seat, 1A by the window, and placed his briefcase gently beneath the seat in front of him. As he adjusted his cuffs and took a seat, he caught the side eye from a man across the aisle. Late 50s, gold watch, salmon-colored shirt, the kind of man who owned golf memberships and had never had his seat questioned. He leaned slightly toward his wife and muttered something Michael couldn't catch, but the glance that followed told him enough. Michael took a deep breath, let out slowly, and looked straight ahead. Moments later, Veronica stepped onto the plane. Michael didn't expect to see her again, but there she was, moving past first-class passengers until she stood at his row. "Sir," she said, her voice now laced with manufactured courtesy, "may I see your boarding pass again?" Michael didn't flinch. He handed it over, without a word, meeting her eyes. She looked at the pass, then back at him, then again at the pass, and said, "Just verifying some system inconsistencies." It's been a hectic day. Of course, Michael said, his tone neutral but cool. We wouldn't want anyone sitting in the wrong section. There was a pause. Veronica's nostrils flared slightly, but she offered nothing more. She handed the pass back and walked away without further explanation. Michael didn't move. He simply folded his hands in his lap and stared forward. To anyone watching, the moment was over. But Michael knew it was just beginning. The woman seated beside him, white early 30s, with designer sunglasses perched on her head, took one look at him and turned her body as far away as the seat would allow. She made a show of pulling out hand sanitizer and applying it twice. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her message was clear. A few rows back, a businessman in a navy blazer and Princeton tie kept glancing at Michael between reading his newspaper, the kind of look that said he's curious but won't admit it. The flight attendant returned with champagne for everyone in the front row. She poured a glass for the man in 1B, smiled at the woman in 1C, and kept walking, never stopping at Michael's row. Michael didn't say a word. He knew this routine too well. Pretend it's an oversight, force the passenger to ask for what they paid for, and when they do, make it seem like they're being aggressive. It was subtle warfare, invisible to anyone who hadn't lived it. But Michael had, for years, and he wasn't going to flinch now. He simply reached into his briefcase, pulled out his tablet, and began reviewing his itinerary. Outside the plane, the last of the passengers were boarding. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, cheerful and smooth, welcoming everyone aboard. First class, meanwhile, had settled into its comfortable silence. Or so it seemed. Michael sat still, composed, unbothered on the surface. But beneath it all, the weight of every gaze, every pause, every calculated slight pressed against him like cabin pressure. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he was taking notes, and they'd soon find out exactly who they were dealing with. He focused instead on the meeting he was flying toward, a multi-billion-dollar partnership that had taken months to negotiate. He wasn't just heading to close the deal. He was finalizing the acquisition of one of the nation's fastest-growing logistics firms, a merger valued at over $700 million. It wasn't just important, it was transformative. And none of these people knew that. Not yet. The woman in 1B pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders and leaned toward the aisle as if Michael's mere proximity were offensive. She pressed the flight attendant call button and whispered something as soon as the blonde attendant arrived. The attendant glanced at Michael mid-conversation, then gave a tight smile and nodded before walking briskly toward the galley. Moments later, Veronica, the same gate agent who had doubted his seat, returned to the cabin with forced professionalism etched into her every movement. She stopped next to Michael's seat and cleared her throat with theatrical purpose. "Mr. Carter," she began, her tone polite on the surface, but tinged with warning. "We've received a concern from another passenger. For everyone's comfort, I'd like to verify one more time that this is your assigned seat." Michael looked up slowly from his tablet, his voice calm but direct. "You've already verified it twice, Ms. Hughes." He made sure to use her name. "Would you like me to pull up the digital confirmation as well?" Veronica hesitated, her professional facade momentarily cracking. She glanced at the tablet he held in his lap, then shook her head stiffly. "That won't be necessary," she said, though her eyes flicked to the woman beside him, who had turned away entirely, pretending to scroll through her phone. The passengers across the aisle were watching now. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while one man in a beige blazer whispered something to his companion. Michael knew how this would look. He'd been in similar rooms before. In boardrooms where no one said you don't belong, but everyone made sure he felt it. The rules were never broken directly. They were bent in ways that could be denied later. Misunderstandings. Procedures. Just doing my job. Michael returned to his work, but the tension in the cabin kept rising. The woman beside him let out a loud sigh and called for the attendant again, this time asking if there was an open seat further away. The attendant offered a weak smile, clearly conflicted, and replied that the flight was full. The woman muttered under her breath, "Of course it is," then gave Michael a glare she didn't bother to hide. The champagne cart finally arrived. Michael watched as glasses were poured and passed down the aisle. When it reached him, the attendant bypassed his row entirely. He waited a moment, then calmly said, "Excuse me, may I have a glass?" The attendant paused as if a question surprised her, then poured a small serving into a flute and handed it to him, without a word. No smile. "No, sir." Just the action, cold and bare. Michael sipped slowly, not because he wanted the drink, but because he refused to let them define his place here. Every passive-aggressive act only sharpened his clarity. These weren't just bad habits. They were cultural symptoms. And they'd just exposed themselves to the wrong man. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man leaned in slightly and asked, "Rough day already?" His tone walked a fine line between sympathy and amusement. Michael met his gaze evenly. "Nothing I haven't handled before," he said, his voice neutral. The man nodded as if he understood, but his smirk said otherwise. The seatbelt sign pinged above them, signaling the final minutes before takeoff. A few heads turned toward the cockpit, others toward their phones. But Michael didn't move. He kept his focus, tapping through slides, updating his final proposal for the deal waiting on the other coast. It gave him comfort, not just because it represented progress, but because it reminded him that he had control where it mattered. Still, Veronica wasn't done. She returned once more, standing in the aisle beside his row and making an announcement loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. If anyone is in a seat they're not assigned, now is the time to notify the crew." The woman beside Michael shifted with visible satisfaction. The man across the aisle chuckled under his breath. Michael's hands didn't move. He didn't look up, but the smile that played at the corners of his mouth was razor-thin and laced with certainty. The plane had just begun its taxi to the runway, but for Michael Carter, the turbulence had already started long before the wheels left the ground. The humiliation he endured thus far had been subtle, calculated, and socially deniable. But now, with tension thick in the pressurized cabin, the performance of casual cruelty escalated into something bolder, something that could no longer be hidden behind protocol. Veronica, who had already made herself known as the gatekeeper of who did and did not belong in first class, returned with the beverage cart, this time exuding a kind of restrained aggression masked beneath her professional mask. She addressed the woman in 1B with warmth, asking if she preferred white or red, sparkling or still. To the couple across the aisle, she smiled and joked, asking how their honeymoon was going. Then she reached Michael's row, and the shift in her body language was immediate. No smile, no eye contact, just movement designed to erase him. He watched her pour glasses for those behind him, skipping his seat entirely, as if he didn't exist. Michael waited until the tray passed him by entirely before calmly saying, "Excuse me, I believe you missed me." Veronica didn't turn immediately. When she did, her expression was tight, her tone clipped. "We're prioritizing premium members today, sir. Champagne is reserved for actual VIPs." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the ambient cabin noise and draw a few eyes toward their row. Michael looked at her, then down at his tablet resting on the tray in front of him. His voice remained level. "My ticket didn't say anything about status requirements for basic hospitality." Veronica crossed her arms, feigning confusion. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. We've had a lot of mix-ups this flight." But there was no misunderstanding, and both of them knew it. Michael leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "If you're going to treat me differently, at least have the decency to be honest about it." Veronica blinked, thrown off by his directness, and for the briefest moment, her composure cracked. Then, with mechanical grace, she poured him a glass of water, warm, flat, and without a word, before moving on. A few moments later, as she passed by again to adjust overhead bins, she noticed Michael's carry-on still tucked partially beneath the seat in front of him, with a soft leather satchel nestled on top of it. In one swift motion, she reached up to adjust a bin and accidentally knocked a half-filled cup of tonic water from the tray above, splashing it directly across his bag. The cold liquid soaked through the edges, staining the corner of a folder that had been poking out of the satchel. Michael reacted instinctively, pulling the bag closer, inspecting the damage. "My apologies," Veronica said too quickly, eyes wide but expression unreadable. "These bins are so tricky sometimes." She didn't offer a napkin. She didn't offer help. She just stood there, waiting for a reaction. Michael locked eyes with her. "That folder held signed agreements," he said flatly. "Irreplaceable ones." Her face didn't change. "Again, I'm sorry," she said with the same rehearsed monotone, then turned and walked off, as if the scene had no more meaning than a spilled drink on a bar counter. A businessman across the aisle, the one who had smirked earlier, now looked away entirely. The woman beside Michael didn't move, but her silence echoed complicity. No one said a word. Not a single passenger, not a single crew member, not even the junior attendant who had witnessed the entire incident, stepped in. The atmosphere was now thick with discomfort, but no one dared break the tension. Michael picked up a napkin from the tray, dabbed at the folder, then placed it back inside his bag with deliberate care. He said nothing. He didn't look up. He just resumed reviewing the agenda for the board presentation scheduled a few hours after landing. But inside, a quiet fire had been lit. She returned to the cabin 15 minutes later, this time holding a small tablet in her hand as if it were an official document of authority. Standing in the aisle directly beside Michael's seat, she cleared her throat and glanced around, ensuring that nearby passengers were watching. "Mr. Carter," she said, voice slightly raised above the usual in-cabin tone. "It appears there may have been an internal seat assignment error. Our records just updated." Michael looked at her, one eyebrow raised. "An error," he said, his voice measured, steady, every syllable wrapped in velvet steel. Veronica tapped the screen with the back of her pen. "According to this," she continued, "your ticket was flagged in the system. These kinds of things happen from time to time, automated reassignment glitches. It looks like you may have been moved further back. Row 31 to be exact." A few passengers in nearby seats paused their conversations and turned slightly to listen. A chuckle escaped from someone 2 rows behind. A whisper rippled through the cabin, carried like pollen on the recycled air. "Maybe he snuck up here," someone murmured, followed by the stifled giggle of a woman who tried and failed to hide her amusement behind a magazine. Michael leaned forward slowly, placing his tablet down with deliberate precision on the tray in front of him. "Row 31, he repeated, looking directly at Veronica. "After you've checked this same ticket twice." Veronica nodded sympathetically, but it was the kind of forced sympathy that came off as theatrical. "I understand the frustration, but sometimes these reassignments happen without us knowing until the last minute." She smiled, as if trying to sell him an apology she didn't mean. "I'll be happy to escort you now." Michael didn't move. He glanced over at the woman beside him, who now had her arms folded and a pleased smirk playing at the corners of her lips. "You can keep your voice down," Michael said calmly. "You've made your point." Veronica blinked, momentarily thrown by his poise. "I'm sorry." Michael met her gaze, unwavering. "This display, it's unnecessary. If you needed to speak with me about something, you could have done so discreetly. But you didn't." Veronica's expression hardened, her smile dropping as quickly as it had risen. "Sir, I'm simply doing my job." From the galley, behind her, a second flight attendant, this one brunette, younger and clearly newer, peeked out, sensing the tension. Veronica turned her head slightly and, forgetting her proximity to Michael, whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "Bet he's on some diversity program ride. Affirmative action never fails." Michael froze. The words struck with surgical precision, not because they were new. He had heard them whispered in conference rooms and clubhouses before, but because of where and how they were said, in public, out loud, with no fear of consequence. He didn't react. He didn't raise his voice or stand up. He simply sat back, eyes now fixed on the back of the seat in front of him. His mind, however, was no longer in that cabin. It was processing, calculating, remembering. From the corner of his vision, he saw the young attendant's face shift. Her mouth parted slightly, as if she wanted to interject, to say something, but her eyes dropped quickly to the floor. She said nothing. She turned away. The silence that followed was heavier than any turbulence. Veronica, clearly satisfied that her suggestion to move had been heard and absorbed by the entire front section, gave one last patronizing nod and turned to leave. As she walked down the aisle, a man in 3A whispered something to his wife, and she laughed, not even trying to be subtle. The air in first class had changed now, not just unfriendly, but quietly hostile, as if Michael's presence itself had become an irritant. Michael exhaled through his nose and reached slowly for his briefcase. She returned to the cabin 15 minutes later, this time holding a small tablet in her hand, as if it were an official document of authority. Standing in the aisle directly beside Michael's seat, she cleared her throat and glanced around, ensuring that nearby passengers were watching. "Mr. Carter," she said, voice slightly raised above the usual in-cabin tone. "It appears there may have been an internal seat assignment error. Our records just updated." Michael looked at her, one eyebrow raised. "An error," he said, his voice measured, steady, every syllable wrapped in velvet steel. Veronica tapped the screen with the back of her pen. "According to this," she continued, "your ticket was flagged in the system. These kinds of things happen from time to time, automated reassignment glitches. It looks like you may have been moved further back. Row 31 to be exact." A few passengers in nearby seats paused their conversations and turned slightly to listen. A chuckle escaped from someone 2 rows behind. A whisper rippled through the cabin, carried like pollen on the recycled air. "Maybe he snuck up here," someone murmured, followed by the stifled giggle of a woman who tried and failed to hide her amusement behind a magazine. Michael leaned forward slowly, placing his tablet down with deliberate precision on the tray in front of him. "Row 31, he repeated, looking directly at Veronica. "After you've checked this same ticket twice." Veronica nodded sympathetically, but it was the kind of forced sympathy that came off as theatrical. "I understand the frustration, but sometimes these reassignments happen without us knowing until the last minute." She smiled, as if trying to sell him an apology she didn't mean. "I'll be happy to escort you now." Michael didn't move. He glanced over at the woman beside him, who now had her arms folded and a pleased smirk playing at the corners of her lips. "You can keep your voice down," Michael said calmly. "You've made your point." Veronica blinked, momentarily thrown by his poise. "I'm sorry." Michael met her gaze, unwavering. "This display, it's unnecessary. If you needed to speak with me about something, you could have done so discreetly. But you didn't." Veronica's expression hardened, her smile dropping as quickly as it had risen. "Sir, I'm simply doing my job." From the galley, behind her, a second flight attendant, this one brunette, younger and clearly newer, peeked out, sensing the tension. Veronica turned her head slightly and, forgetting her proximity to Michael, whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "Bet he's on some diversity program ride. Affirmative action never fails." Michael froze. The words struck with surgical precision, not because they were new. He had heard them whispered in conference rooms and clubhouses before, but because of where and how they were said, in public, out loud, with no fear of consequence. He didn't react. He didn't raise his voice or stand up. He simply sat back, eyes now fixed on the back of the seat in front of him. His mind, however, was no longer in that cabin. It was processing, calculating, remembering. From the corner of his vision, he saw the young attendant's face shift. Her mouth parted slightly, as if she wanted to interject, to say something, but her eyes dropped quickly to the floor. She said nothing. She turned away. The silence that followed was heavier than any turbulence. Veronica, clearly satisfied that her suggestion to move had been heard and absorbed by the entire front section, gave one last patronizing nod and turned to leave. As she walked down the aisle, a man in 3A whispered something to his wife, and she laughed, not even trying to be subtle. The air in first class had changed now, not just unfriendly, but quietly hostile, as if Michael's presence itself had become an irritant. Michael exhaled through his nose and reached slowly for his briefcase. The quiet war Veronica had been waging against Michael Carter since boarding had turned from microaggressions into open hostility. But what she didn't realize was that her final act, the moment she thought would finally put him in his place, would instead become the one that exposed her to the entire cabin. As she returned to first class, her face still tense from the failed attempt to intimidate the lost student in 2D. She paused beside Michael's seat once more. Her eyes locked on the glimmer of his Patek Philippe watch, rose gold, understated elegance, the kind that whispered power rather than shouted wealth. She leaned against the aisle seat just enough to show she wasn't passing by, her lips curling into a sneer that looked like a smile to anyone not paying attention. "Nice watch," she said loudly enough for several nearby passengers to hear. Michael looked up at her, expression unreadable, but said nothing. She continued, voice laced with venomous amusement. "Fake flex, though. I mean, don't take this the wrong way, but if you're going to wear something like that, make sure you've got the rest of the package to match." A few passengers blinked, glancing toward her in confusion. Others furrowed their brows, uncertain if they had just witnessed what they thought they had. Veronica, mistaking their silence for agreement, doubled down. "Next time, save enough to buy respect before the accessories," she added, then gave a small, triumphant sniff as if she'd won something. Michael remained silent. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the watch. He simply stared at her like she was air. The complete lack of reaction only seemed to provoke her further. She raised her voice, her tone now sharp, brittle, no longer pretending to be professional. "Are you even listening, sir?" she snapped, drawing even more attention. Michael looked past her, calm as stone. That's when she snapped. "Answer me," she shouted, her voice sharp enough to slice through the cabin. The sound startled a young boy across the aisle, no older than 5, who clutched his stuffed bear and began to cry. His mother turned around quickly, eyes wide, pulling him close and giving Veronica a glare that held genuine alarm. But Veronica didn't apologize. She didn't lower her voice. She simply stood there, jaw tight, eyes burning holes into Michael's unmoving figure. The boy's father stood up halfway, ready to say something, but hesitated. The silence that followed her outburst felt longer than it was. People weren't just uncomfortable now, they were disturbed. Veronica realized it too late. She straightened her posture, cleared her throat, and turned abruptly toward the galley, trying to salvage her composure. But the damage had been done. What began as a power trip was now a fully publicized unraveling of control. In her need to dominate, she had drawn a spotlight straight onto herself. And in the flickering reflection of Michael's polished watch, that spotlight burned brighter than she expected. Michael slowly reached for his water, took a measured sip, and placed the cup back onto the tray table with deliberate quiet. Then he spoke, not to Veronica, who had retreated, but to no one in particular, his voice calm, steady, and chillingly clear. "People often say the uniform makes the role," he said aloud. "But some people forget, it doesn't make the character." The man in 2C gave a quiet, thoughtful nod. The mother of the crying boy looked over at Michael and mouthed a soft, sincere thank you. The law student had resumed recording, this time not from secrecy, but with the phone openly resting in his hand. Across the cabin, glances began to shift, not at Michael, but at Veronica's empty place near the galley. Doubt was no longer creeping in. It was flooding. And somewhere in that cabin, Michael knew, the shift had begun. The atmosphere inside first class had shifted from silent judgment to quiet discomfort. Passengers who once found amusement in Veronica's antics were now shifting in their seats, unsure whether to continue pretending not to notice or finally acknowledge the tension they had been complicit in. Michael Carter sat with the same composed posture, but now the gravity around him had changed. His silence no longer felt like submission, it felt like dominance. It was a silence that made people nervous, that made them wonder what they'd missed. And then, as fate would have it, someone did. Just as the crew dimmed the cabin lights to simulate dusk, a teenage boy seated 2 rows behind Michael leaned closer to his tablet. The screen lit up his face in a cool glow as he scrolled through a breaking business headline, then paused, blinking. He looked again, then looked toward Michael, then back to the tablet, mouth falling open slightly. "Wait," he muttered, barely loud enough for those next to him to hear, but in the quiet cabin, it carried like a spark in dry air. "Is that him?" he said louder. "The guy who just closed the $700 million logistics acquisition." His voice hit like a switch. Heads turned, conversation stopped, and curiosity bloomed into full attention. A middle-aged woman in 3C glanced over, furrowing her brow, then turned toward her husband and whispered, "Michael Carter?" "That's what the article says." "Look." The man leaned over, pulled up the Forbes app on his own phone, tapped a headline, and then turned his screen toward the row behind Michael. The image showed a sharply dressed black man stepping out of a black SUV, surrounded by executives, shaking hands with international investors. The headline was bold, unmistakable. "Michael Carter finalizes $700 million takeover. The man reshaping global logistics." A second later, a man in his 50s let out a low whistle and said aloud, "That's him. That's Michael Carter. I saw him on CNBC yesterday. He's everywhere right now." The cabin came alive in a different way now, not with mockery, not with passive glances, but with recognition. Faces that had once held skepticism now displayed dawning awareness. Conversations turned. Murmurs spread. Some passengers began typing his name into Google. Others simply stared. And still, Michael didn't say a word. He didn't look up. He didn't react. He simply sat, the faintest hint of a knowing smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. In the galley, Veronica was finishing a cup of coffee she'd poured for herself when she caught the whispers. She stepped out to find a half-dozen passengers turned toward Michael's seat. Confused, she leaned toward Craig, the senior flight attendant, and asked, "What's going on?" Craig looked at her, raised his eyebrows, and replied dryly, "Apparently your problem passenger is on the cover of Forbes." Veronica blinked. "What?" Craig showed her his phone. "Michael Carter," he said. "CEO. Investor. Just dropped $700 million to buy out one of our primary logistics partners. He's the guy everyone's been talking about this quarter." Veronica's face drained of color. "That can't be," she began, but Craig had already walked past her. Behind her, more passengers were now murmuring his name as if they'd known him all along. The law student in 2D muttered under his breath, "You messed with the wrong man," and raised his phone a little higher. Veronica stood frozen in place. The words she had said, the tone she had used, the power she thought she held, they all collapsed in real time. She wasn't in control anymore. She had never been. The silence Michael had maintained wasn't weakness. It was patience, precision, restraint. And now, with the truth surfacing on its own, he didn't need to say anything to be heard. The entire cabin had heard enough. Passengers who had once refused to make eye contact now looked at him with something new: guilt, admiration, shame. Some offered nods, others adjusted their tone, and one man even shifted slightly to the side as if clearing space for him, though Michael hadn't moved. But Veronica, still standing near the curtain separating first class from the galley, looked like she'd seen a ghost. The blood had drained from her face, her posture rigid, fingers clenched tight around the edge of the service cart. She had been so certain, so smug, that Michael didn't belong, so consumed by her assumptions that she had failed to recognize the man sitting quietly in 1A was someone with the power to write her fate into corporate history. Slowly, Michael set his glass down and reached into the inner sleeve of his carry-on, pulling out a slim, dark laptop. The moment he opened it, the screen illuminated with a biometric login. A fingerprint. A blink. Access granted. With a few taps, he mirrored his screen to the 17-inch monitor embedded in the wall of the first-class cabin, a feature designed for executive travelers during private presentations. The cabin dimmed slightly as the screen flickered to life, revealing a sleek pitch deck titled in crisp Helvetica, Strategic Acquisition Summary, Escalation X Carter Global Capital. There was no dramatic music, no theatrics, just cold, clean facts. Slide after slide revealed financials, infrastructure models, operations reports, and one key figure that flashed across the screen: $700 million. A direct equity deal to acquire 40% ownership stake in Escalation, the parent company of the airline they were flying on. A hush fell over the cabin. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade. In the center of the deck was a name listed under Lead Executive and Financial Authority: Michael A. Carter, CEO, Carter Global Capital. No one in the room needed a degree in finance to understand what this meant. He wasn't just a wealthy man in a nice suit. He wasn't just the subject of a trending Forbes article. He was the person orchestrating one of the most high-stakes acquisitions in the company's history. And they had just spent the past 2 hours treating him like an intruder. The woman who had refused to speak to him earlier gasped audibly and covered her mouth with her hand. A man who had laughed at the seat reassignment joke now avoided eye contact entirely, his face flushed with guilt. Veronica took a step back, her voice caught in her throat. But Michael didn't even look at her. He tapped his phone once, opened a secure app, and typed in a message with clinical precision. It read, "Withdraw offer, full blacklist, initiate PR protocol, no further contact." Then, without ceremony, he hit send. The consequences of that message rippled far beyond the walls of the plane. Somewhere in a boardroom, an acquisition team would freeze mid-discussion. An executive team would scramble. Shareholders would get alerts. And somewhere in corporate, a group of people would realize that Veronica's actions had just cost the airline its largest deal in over a decade. Michael closed the laptop slowly, methodically, as if sealing away a chapter. He tucked it back into his carry-on, then straightened his posture, glancing toward the forward cabin. The flight crew stood frozen. One young attendant, Grace, looked devastated. She had seen everything, heard every word, but hadn't dared speak. Now, shame burned bright across her face. "Mr. Carter," she began softly, but he held up a hand, not to silence her, but to show he understood. She wasn't the target. Not her. Not anymore. Behind him, a few passengers clapped softly, half admiration, half apology, but he didn't acknowledge it. He didn't need validation. The silence was enough. Veronica, on the other hand, looked like a statue, her mind clearly racing, her face pale, her knees slightly buckling. She took a slow step forward as if trying to reclaim professionalism, but her voice cracked when she finally spoke. "Mr. Carter, I didn't know," she whispered. He turned toward her, not with rage, not with arrogance, but with piercing, level calm. "No, MS. Hughes," he said. "You didn't care to know. That's the difference." Then he turned back to his seat, put on his noise-canceling headphones, and leaned back as if nothing had happened at all. And for the rest of the flight, no one dared disturb him. Michael Carter had remained in his seat the entire time, composed, his headphones resting loosely around his neck, gaze distant but not absent. He had said nothing more since the last blow was dealt, yet the silence spoke louder than anything she could have imagined. As the wheels touched the runway and the cabin rattled with the familiar thud of arrival, a collective exhale passed through first class, but Michael's expression didn't shift. He wasn't satisfied. He wasn't angry. He was resolved. When the plane taxied to a full stop and the seatbelt sign chimed off, passengers rose cautiously, collecting bags and glancing toward the front of the aircraft. A quiet tension swept through the aisle. Then, something unexpected happened. Standing just outside the cabin door was a tall, sharply dressed man in a navy blue suit with the airline's logo pinned discreetly on his lapel. Robert Lang, Executive Vice President of Escalation. His presence was not routine. It was calculated. He stepped on board before any other ground staff could approach, his eyes scanning the front cabin with focused gravity. He walked straight to Michael's row, extended a hand, and said, with calm sincerity, "Mr. Carter, I'm here to offer our deepest apology on behalf of the company and the entire board." Michael rose slowly, shook the man's hand, and simply nodded. Robert turned to the remaining crew members, his tone shifting to something colder. "Where is MS Hughes?" Veronica stepped forward, trying to muster professionalism, though her voice faltered. "Sir, I didn't know who he was. I was only trying to manage." Robert cut her off, not with volume, but with finality. "You weren't hired to manage passengers. You were hired to uphold the standards of respect this airline was built on. Your uniform doesn't make you immune from accountability. You're relieved of duty, effective immediately." Gasps followed his words. A few passengers had pulled out their phones again, not to record out of malice, but because they understood this was no longer just a flight. It was a reckoning playing out in real time. Veronica's face crumbled. her eyes darting toward Michael as if pleading for mercy. But he didn't look at her. He simply picked up his carry-on and stepped aside to let others exit first. Outside the plane, word was already spreading. The law student in 2D, whose video had captured every degrading moment, had posted the footage online during the descent. The caption was simple: "This is what casual racism looks like at 35,000 feet." Within 6 hours, the clip had gone viral. 8 million views, hundreds of thousands of comments. Public outrage exploded across social media platforms. Influencers, news anchors, and even celebrities began reposting it, tagging the airline's official accounts, calling for accountability. The hashtag Justice for Michael began trending globally. By the time Michael's car pulled up curbside, press inquiries were already pouring into the airline's PR office. Anonymous employees leaked internal emails confirming the canceled acquisition, igniting shareholder panic. Stocks dropped 3% in the first 2 hours of trading. Boardroom emergency meetings were scheduled. And Veronica? Her name was already circulating in headlines, not as a professional, but as a cautionary tale. Within 24 hours, employment agencies rejected her application on review. Airline unions refused to support her appeal. Former colleagues distanced themselves. And for the first time in her career, the woman who once prided herself on knowing who belonged found herself shut out from every door she thought she controlled. Veronica Hughes sat alone at the corner of a downtown coffee shop, the late afternoon sun casting long streaks of gold across the marble floor, her fingers nervously tapping against the edge of a lukewarm cappuccino she had barely touched. A week had passed since the flight, but to her, time no longer moved in days. It moved in headlines, notifications, and silence. She had tried to regain control, filing a grievance against the airline for wrongful termination, claiming emotional distress, citing her tenure, her spotless record, and alleging discrimination of her own. But no one came to her defense. Not the union, not the airline, not even her former colleagues. The grievance was dismissed within 48 hours. The internal review not only upheld her termination, but cited her behavior as a direct threat to company values and public image. 12 applications she'd submitted to competing airlines returned silent rejections. One recruiter left a voice message that was as awkward as it was honest: "We just can't take the PR risk right now." Her name had become searchable for all the wrong reasons. Video clips, hashtags, think pieces titled "When Power Meets Prejudice" or "Why First Class Still Isn't Equal." Her once comfortable world had narrowed into a reality defined by reputation and shame. Across the cafe, a muted television hung in the corner, running a segment from Forbes Now. Veronica didn't look up at first, but when she heard the name, Michael Carter, her eyes flicked toward the screen as if pulled by gravity. There he was, sitting across from a journalist on a stage in San Francisco, calm as ever, answering questions about leadership, strategy, and equity. The camera panned to a giant screen behind them, displaying the cover of the latest Forbes magazine. Michael Carter, the man who crashed prejudice with a $700 million decision. Veronica stared at the screen. The headline wasn't vengeful. It wasn't angry. It was powerful, quiet, resolute. And that made it worse. He hadn't needed to destroy her. He hadn't needed to shout or retaliate or name her publicly. He had simply let the truth speak, and everyone else had done the rest. But for the first time, she didn't feel like the victim. She felt seen. Not the way she was used to being seen, respected by title or uniform, but truly seen. She saw herself in the way others must have seen her on that plane. And she hated it. The memory of her own voice echoed in her mind. Fake flex. Champagne is for actual VIPs. Move to the back. She winced, remembering the way she had said those words with conviction, with certainty. She had believed them. That was the part she couldn't excuse. No amount of excuses about policy or procedure could undo the fact that deep down, she had believed he didn't belong. But now, sitting alone, no job offers, no uniform, no shield of authority, she realized something she never had before. It was never about power. It was about presence. Michael hadn't needed to assert dominance. He had owned the space by knowing exactly who he was, even when no one else gave him the respect he deserved. Veronica looked back at the screen one more time as the program transitioned to Michael being handed a standing ovation at a leadership summit. He smiled, gracious and grounded, then offered closing words she could read from the caption below. True power isn't measured by control. It's measured by how you treat people when you think you don't need to. Her eyes stung, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached into her tote and pulled out a notebook. For the first time in her life, she wrote the words, "I was wrong." And then, without knowing what would come next, she wrote another sentence, "I want to do better." Months later, Veronica found herself volunteering at a local nonprofit that offered workplace equity training. Not as an instructor, as a student. She didn't post about it. She didn't tell anyone. She simply showed up, week after week, learning, unlearning, listening. Across the city, Michael Carter continued his work, expanding his global initiatives, investing in education and leadership programs that opened doors for those who had long been overlooked. He never spoke of the flight publicly, not once, because he didn't need to. What happened on that plane had already rewritten the narrative, not just for him, but for everyone watching. And one day, long after the headlines had faded and the algorithms had moved on, Veronica passed by a bookstore and saw Michael's face again, on the cover of a new book titled Altitude, Rising Above Bias with Grace. She didn't look away. She walked in, bought a copy, and read every word. And for the first time in her life, she understood that redemption doesn't come from proving you were right. It comes from facing the truth and choosing to live differently because of it. The end. If this story moved you, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you never miss powerful content like this. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it the reveal, the confrontation, or the final redemption? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.